The Midnight Spirit, a true story. Tom was a quiet man who lived a simple life in a small, old house at the edge of a sleepy village. The house, worn with age, had stood for nearly a century, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the dead of night. Tom had always felt a strange connection to the house, like it was calling him, but he never thought much of it. He liked the solitude, the silence, and the way the world seemed to disappear when he was inside. One cold November evening, Tom sat by the fireplace, enjoying the warmth as he read a book. The wind howled outside, and the branches of the old trees scratched against the windows like fingernails on a chalkboard. Tom was used to the sounds. They didn't bother him. He was lost in his book when he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. He froze, his eyes slowly lifting from the page. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but curious. There was no response, just the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Tom shook his head, convinced it was his imagination, and returned to his book. But then he heard it again, this time clearer. It was his name, Tom. A shiver ran down his spine. He looked around the room, the shadows flickering on the walls, but there was no one there. He set his book aside and stood up, his heart beginning to race. "Who's there?" he repeated, but still there was no answer. The house was silent, save for the whispering wind and the crackle of the fire. Tom walked slowly around the room, checking every corner, but he found nothing. He was alone. As he stood in the middle of the room, he felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. He pulled his sweater tighter around him and sat back down by the fire, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. As the night went on, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept glancing at the corners of the room, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was even more unsettling. Finally, he decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring him peace. Tom climbed the narrow stairs to his bedroom, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. His bedroom was small and simple, with a large bed covered in heavy blankets and a single window that overlooked the dark forest. He undressed quickly and slipped under the covers, pulling them up to his chin as he stared at the ceiling. But sleep didn't come easily. He lay there for what felt like hours, his mind racing with thoughts of the whisper. Just as he began to drift off, he heard it again, this time right next to his ear. "Tom." He bolted upright, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. He reached for the lamp on his bedside table and flicked it on, flooding the room with a warm glow. There was no one there. He was alone. But the whisper had been so clear, so close. He got out of bed and searched the room, his hands shaking. He checked the closet, under the bed, even the small bathroom attached to the bedroom. But there was nothing. No one. He was alone. But then, as he stood in the middle of the room, he saw it, a shadow, just outside the window. Tom froze, staring at the shadow that seemed to be hovering just beyond the glass. It was tall, human-shaped, but there was something off about it. Its edges were blurred, like it wasn't fully solid. He took a step closer, his breath fogging up the glass as he peered out into the darkness. The shadow moved. Tom jumped back, his heart racing. The shadow didn't disappear. It just floated there, staring at him. He couldn't see any features, but he could feel its gaze, cold and penetrating. He wanted to run, to hide, but he was rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the figure outside. Then, slowly, the shadow raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Tom gasped as he saw the hand. It was transparent, like smoke, but it left a clear print on the glass. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Tom, he backed away, his legs trembling. The shadow didn't move, didn't follow him. It just stood there, watching him, its hand still pressed against the glass. Tom reached for the lamp and turned it off, plunging the room back into darkness. He hoped that maybe, if he couldn't see it, it would go away. But the shadow remained. Tom crawled back into bed, pulling the covers over his head like a child hiding from a monster. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying that when he opened them again, the shadow would be gone. But when he finally gathered the courage to peek out from under the blankets, it was still there, its cold, dark presence filling the room. The whisper came again, so close that it felt like the words were being breathed into his ear. "Tom, come to me." He squeezed his eyes shut again, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder. The shadow was inside the room now, standing at the foot of his bed. He could feel it, a heavy, oppressive presence that made it hard to breathe. Tom didn't know how long he lay there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually exhaustion overtook him. He drifted off into a fitful sleep, haunted by nightmares of the shadowy figure. When he woke the next morning, the room was empty. The shadow was gone, and the house was silent once more. But the unease lingered. He could still feel the cold presence, like it had left a mark on him, something that couldn't be shaken off. Days passed, and Tom tried to convince himself that it had all been a dream, a trick of the mind. But the whisper never truly left him. Every night, as he lay in bed, he could hear it, just on the edge of hearing, calling his name, beckoning him. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world was silent and the shadows were long, he would see it again, just outside the window or in the corner of his room, waiting for him. Tom knew that one day he would have to answer the call. The shadow was patient, but it would not be denied. It was only a matter of time before it claimed him, body and soul, and he would join the others who had come before him, lost to the darkness, forever whispering in the shadows.